Our next speaker is John Ross. John is Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China. And since 1992 and the publication of his Why Economic Reform Succeeded in China and Will Fail in Russia and Eastern Europe, he has written over 500 pieces, probably more now. I'm reading a slightly dated biography here, on China's economy and geopolitical relations, but he has also been a close observer of events in Russia, where he has visited repeatedly, both before and after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, John, please go ahead.
Yeah, obviously, I think I should start off by explaining my intersection with this situation. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was obvious that there was going to be a fundamental change in the world situation. So I moved to Moscow. And from 1992 to 2000, I lived in Moscow. I don't want to attempt to claim great credit or anything, but I had my material was published and distributed to all members of the Russian parliament and so on. So that's just to say that it was not an accidental interaction, therefore, with the situation in Russia. I must say that I do not agree with Hanya, or I don't agree with Oleg on the tactical things. I was not surprised by the outbreak of the war. And I can show this very clearly. On various WhatsApp groups that I'm a member of, there were various members of the Western left who were saying that what has been the attacks on Russia for the threat of war, or the equivalent to weapons of mass destruction, lies made by the US before the Iraq war. And I intervened, I sent them messages saying, this is not correct. There is a real threat of war. More important than that, 30 years before, I said to various people in Russia who I had to advise, because I was asked my advice, that there's going to be a civil war in Ukraine. I thought actually that it would take place before it has done now. So therefore you can say the timing was wrong, but that was the fundamental situation. Why? Because it's interaction of the situation within Ukraine and with the international situation. Ukraine is a state, but it is not a single nationality. There are, in fact, a number of nationalities in Ukraine, actually very small minorities, Romanians, Hungarians, etc. But fundamentally, there are two nations within Ukraine. One is Western Ukraine, which speaks Ukrainian. It follows the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and was for a long period part of Poland. And there is the Eastern Ukraine, which for about 200 to 300 years, depending on exactly where, has been part of Russia. This is the national question within the Ukraine. Now, it's true that the unity of the Ukrainian state could be maintained as long as there was no attempt by one part of the country to impose its will upon the other part of the country. Let me take a comparison, which some people will be very familiar with, which is Canada. Canada has just about maintained its unity by a bilingual policy. It shouldn't be forgotten that about twice, Quebec has come very close to demanding independence. If you had an attempt to suppress the Russian language, to suppress the people in the east of Ukraine, this is entirely comparable to if, for example, it was suddenly announced in Canada that French was not to be spoken outside Quebec, that the language laws which maintain bilingualism in Canada were to be scrapped. What would happen is undoubtedly it would push the majority of the population of Quebec over the barrier from wanting to be part of a binational state to wanting to be an independent state. That is the situation. The reason for estimating, therefore, that there would be a civil war in the Ukraine was because the United States had no intention of allowing a neutral situation. The neutrality of Ukraine could have been maintained, or the unity of Ukraine could have been maintained by a neutral policy. for Ukraine. But the United States never had any intention of respecting this. And it was obvious that if the United States moved into Ukraine to attempt to impose international policies, membership of NATO, which was unacceptable to Russia and unacceptable to the Russian minority within the east of Ukraine, if it carried out actions such as banning the official use of the Russian language, which is spoken by 30% of the population of the Ukraine, if it did that, it would split up Ukraine, resulting in the civil war. And I had no illusions that it would be the aggressive intention of the United States to pursue such a policy. That's why I believe civil war was was the outcome that was likely in Ukraine. Second situation, what is this? This is a continuous policy of aggression by the United States against Russia. Everybody knows, and we could give lots of quotations, that the United States promised that NATO would not advance into Eastern Europe after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That was systematically violated. But it's also the case that Russia attempted to make very great goodwill gestures towards the United States, to the point where Putin admitted that Russia proposed even to enter into NATO, which would have given Russia veto rights over the aggressive actions against Russia. It attempted to come to an agreement with the United States in the fight against Islamic terrorism after the US invasion of Afghanistan. I actually think that Russia had illusions in the United States at the time and made excessive concessions, but leave that aside. What was absolutely clear was Russia was not pursuing an aggressive policy against the United States, but the United States pursued an aggressive policy against Russia. What then happens? This determines the internal dynamics within Russia. Russia is being subject to aggression, and therefore the forces within Russia are those forces which will defend the country. The most decisive issue in Russia is Russian patriotism. I very much regret that Boris is not here, and that Alexander Buskalin is not there. They were my earliest contacts in Russia. And I'm afraid, my view, that they failed to understand that the situation in Russia is a fight for Russia's defense against the Western aggression. And for that reason, the KPRF has become the dominant force of the left in Russia, because it understands that what is engaged in Russia is a fight for Russia's right to power and defense against the aggression by the United States. Finally, just to put it in an international context, the way I would put it is that the struggle in Ukraine is the Western flank of the defense of China. Because what is happening is, it is not the case that the United States foreign policy establishment regards Russia as its most important enemy. It doesn't. The United States foreign policy establishment, whatever their differences on tactics, regards China as its most important enemy. But it understands that the good relations between China and Russia are a big obstacle to United States aggression against China. And therefore, its aim is to separate China and Russia and create bad relations. Some of them want to do it by, excuse me, slightly sexist phrase, but by seduction. That is, making concessions to Russia. Others want to do it by forcing Russia to break with China, but they all agree that they want to separate China and Russia because it will then be much easier to attack China. So China has a direct interest in this. So we may put it in the following way. The most fundamental enemy of the United States foreign policy is China. In order to attack China, it has to separate Russia from China. Incidentally, as a third thing, not the most important, it also wants to do in Germany, because by weakening the economic relations between Russia and Germany, it weakens Germany. Therefore, the aggressive policy of the United States towards Russia is aimed at 1, China, 2, Russia, and 3, Germany. Right, then don't worry, 10 seconds, Radical, right, okay. Therefore, Russia has, for the 4th time in the last 2 centuries, engaged in a struggle to defend itself. The first was the invasion by Napoleon. The second was the invasion by the whites in 1918. The third was the invasion by Hitler in 1941. And this is now the 4th situation in which Russia has to defend itself against aggression coming from Europe. And that's the fundamental features of the situation, and all else is tactics, propaganda, etc. End.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and want to like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.